The chapel air was colder than the grave they had prepared for him. It clung to the stone, to the dark wood of the pews, and to the thin silk of Rebecca's borrowed dress. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of afternoon light slanting from a high, leaded window, illuminating the man beside her. The Duke of Stanhope, her husband. He was a tall man, or had been, before the illness stooped his shoulders and carved hollows beneath his cheekbones. His skin had the translucent pallor of fine porcelain, stretched taut over a skull. He swayed, his weight supported by a grim-faced valet on one side and the altar rail on the other. His breathing was a faint, dry rasp, like dead leaves skittering across flagstones. Rebecca could feel the collective gaze of her family, her father, her stepmother, her brother, boring into her back. They were not watching a wedding. They were witnessing the signing of a deed. They had sold her for this, for the house, the title, the lands that would flow through her, their vessel, and into their deserving hands the moment that shallow breath finally ceased. The priest, a man whose face was a mask of professional piety, murmured the final words. A ring was pressed into Rebecca's cold hand. It was heavy, a wide band of gold, unadorned and severe. She slid it onto the Duke's finger, his skin shockingly cool. His valet had to guide his hand to do the same for her. The metal felt like a manacle. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the priest declared to the silent, frigid air. It was done. Her father's smile was a brief, triumphant slash in his beard. Her stepmother's eyes were already measuring the tapestries. As the valet moved to guide the Duke away, he paused, turning his head with an effort that seemed to cost him everything. His eyes, a startlingly clear, pale gray, found hers. They were not clouded with pain or confusion, as she had been led to expect. They were lucid, sharp, and filled with a dark, weary intelligence. His lips, chapped and pale, parted. A whisper, so quiet it was more a vibration in the air between them than a sound. "This is not what it seems," he breathed. Then, his strength gave out. His eyes fluttered closed, and the valet took his full weight, half carrying him from the chapel. The heavy oak door closed behind them with the finality of a coffin lid, leaving Rebecca alone with her purchasers. The mystery of his words hung in the chilling silence, a single unlit candle in the vast darkness of Stanhope Hall. Why had he looked at her with such clarity? What did he mean? The door to her old life was shut, and the door to this new one had just closed on a dying man and his secret. Thank you for joining our story. Subscribe for more tales of love found in the most unexpected circumstances, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. The story of the dying Duke and his clever bride is only just beginning. 4 years earlier, Rebecca's hands had smelled of chamomile and feverfew, her fingers perpetually stained with the juice of elderberries. She had been apprenticed to Master Hemlock, the apothecary in Cresswell, a man whose knowledge of herbs was as deep and gnarled as the roots of the mandrake he so prized. He had taught her the language of plants, the calming whisper of lavender, the fierce shout of foxglove, the steadying hand of willowbark. She learned to grind, to distill, to measure with the precision of a watchmaker. Her mind, starved for order and purpose in her father's chaotic household, thrived. She filled notebooks with detailed drawings of leaves and flowers, documenting dosages and effects, her handwriting neat and certain. That life ended with a letter, sealed with her father's imperious crest. She was 21, and her hobby, as he called it, was over. She was needed at home for more useful purposes, to be married off. The suitor, a neighboring baron with more ambition than sense, courted her for a season, his eyes always on her father's shipping ledgers, not on her. Rebecca, using the skills she'd honed, had quietly reorganized those same ledgers, turning a failing enterprise into a modestly profitable one. Her father took the credit, of course. Her contributions were as invisible as the air. Then the Baron, discovering a wealthier heiress, dissolved the engagement with a curt note that spoke of incompatibility, but was written in the ink of pure finance. The humiliation was public, but the consequences were private. Her father, having overextended himself in anticipation of the union, was ruined. Creditors circled. The house grew cold, the meals meager. Her stepmother's resentment, once a low simmer, came to a rolling boil. Useless, she would hiss, watching Rebecca read one of the herbalism texts she had managed to keep. All that time spent playing with weeds, and you couldn't even hold a man. Then came the solution. The Duke of Stanhope, reclusive and fabulously wealthy, was dying. He had no direct heirs. His estate would go to a distant, grasping cousin unless he married. A solicitor, acting for the Duke, had made a quiet inquiry. They needed a bride. Any bride of gentle birth would do. It was a race against death. Her father saw his salvation. A contract was drawn up not with the Duke's house, but between Rebecca and her father. She would marry the Duke. Upon his inevitable imminent death, she, the Duchess, would inherit. A second contract, already signed by a desperate Rebecca under duress, stipulated that control of the entire Stanhope estate would then be managed by her father as a trustee. It was a clean, bloodless transaction. She was the key, and they would turn her in the lock. "He will not last a fortnight," her father had said, his voice brimming with a greedy, funereal reverence. "You will do your duty, Rebecca. You will sit by his bed, look suitably somber, and wait." He did not ask. He commanded. She had packed a single bag, her few simple dresses, and tucked in the bottom her leather-bound notebook from Master Hemlock. It was all she had left of the person she had been. Her arrival at Stanhope Hall was an entrance into a house that seemed to be holding its breath. A long gravel drive cut through acres of parkland gone wild, the ancient oaks heavy with moss, the lawns shaggy and unkempt. The house itself was a great grim pile of granite, its many windows like vacant eyes staring out at the encroaching wilderness. The air inside was still and cool, smelling of beeswax and old stone and something else, the faint, cloying sweetness of decay. A housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, met her in the cavernous entry hall. She was a tall, severe woman in black bombazine, her face a study in disciplined sorrow. She did not offer welcome, only a curt nod. "Your Grace," she said, the title sounding strange and brittle in the echoing space. She led Rebecca not to a grand drawing room, but to a small, dark study lined with books that were shedding their leather bindings. The Duke's solicitor, a Mr. Finch, was waiting. He was a small, dry man who looked as if he were made of parchment himself. He did not rise. "Duchess," he said, his voice a rustle of papers. "Let us be clear on the terms of this arrangement, so there are no future misunderstandings." It was the contract scene she had been expecting, a verbal confirmation of the cage she had entered. His Grace, the Duke, requires a wife to secure the succession of the estate and prevent it from falling into the hands of his cousin, Lord Ashworth, a man he despises. You, by this marriage, fulfill that requirement. He paused, his gaze flat and unemotional. In return, you are provided with the station and security of a duchess. You will oversee the domestic management of this house. You will want for nothing material. He steepled his fingers. What his grace will not and cannot offer is companionship, affection, or any emotional involvement. His condition precludes it. He is dying. Your role is to be his widow. Do you understand? The words were spoken with the same dispassionate tone a man might use to discuss crop yields or the price of iron. It was a business transaction, pure and simple. Rebecca looked at the cold fireplace, at the dust on the mantel. She thought of her father's triumphant smile, her stepmother's venomous whispers, the suffocating cruelty of her old home. Here, there was no pretense, only a cold, clear, and honest indifference. Coldness was a thing you could wear like a cloak. It was survivable. Active cruelty was a poison that seeped into the bones. "I understand," she said, her voice steady. "Very well, mister," Finch concluded, already gathering his papers. "Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms. They are in the east wing. The Duke's rooms are in the west. A bell connects your chambers to the kitchens should you require anything." The geography of the house was a map of their marriage. Separate, connected only by the apparatus of service. Mrs. Gable led her up a grand, sweeping staircase, its marble steps worn into shallow bowls by generations of footsteps. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of their shoes and the distant, mournful cry of a rook. This was her new life. A vast, silent house, a dying husband, and a contract. It was not a rescue. It was an exchange of prisons. In the days that followed, Rebecca began to inhabit the silence of Stanhope Hall. Her rooms were vast and opulent, filled with heavy damask curtains that blocked the light and furniture that stood like shrouded ghosts under dust covers. She felt like a guest in a museum, a temporary exhibit soon to be removed. But idleness was a luxury she had never known, and a state she could not tolerate. Her mind, so long trained to observe, to diagnose, to find remedies, began to work on the house itself. She started with the household accounts, which she requested from a wary Mrs. Gable. The ledgers were a disaster of haphazard entries and exorbitant prices from local suppliers. Within a week, she had balanced them, identified 3 purveyors who were blatantly overcharging the estate, and drafted letters renegotiating the terms. She sent them to the steward, a Mr. Croft, whose resistance to her involvement melted into grudging respect when the new contracts returned, saving the estate a considerable sum each month. Next, she turned her attention to the house itself. She walked its corridors, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She discovered a library, a magnificent 2-story room with a rolling ladder, where the books were not merely shedding their bindings, but were riddled with damp. She began the painstaking process of airing them, cleaning them, and reorganizing them by subject. And she found the garden. Behind a high stone wall, through a rusted iron gate for which she had to request the key, was a physic garden, utterly abandoned. It was a ruin of weeds and thorns, but beneath the chaos she saw the ghosts of what it had been. Gnarled rose bushes choked by bindweed, the faint silver-green leaves of a surviving sage plant, the stubborn stalks of what might be angelica. Here was work her hands understood. She spent her afternoons there, dressed in a plain work dress, methodically clearing, digging, and tending. The staff, who had at first moved around her like silent specters, began to change. Elspeth, a young housemaid assigned to her, started leaving a tray of tea and a plate of biscuits for her on the garden bench. Mrs. Gable, finding Rebecca in the library late one night, her face smudged with dust, simply placed a warmer shawl around her shoulders without a word. Their suspicion was slowly giving way to a cautious, watchful respect. From the window of his sick room in the West Wing, Alistair watched her. He saw her in the garden, her brow furrowed in concentration as she staked a struggling rose. He saw her in the library, her slight frame perched atop the ladder, reaching for a high shelf. He heard the reports from Mrs. Gable about the corrected accounts, the renegotiated supplies. He had expected a simpering, frightened girl, a pawn of a greedy family. He saw instead a woman of quiet, relentless competence. She did not weep or wring her hands. She did not perform gratitude or sorrow. She simply worked. She assessed the broken things around her and methodically began to mend them. Their few interactions were brief and formal. They sometimes took their evening meal in a small, private dining room. He would eat a few spoonfuls of thin broth, while she ate a simple dinner of roast chicken and potatoes. The silence between them was vast, but it was not empty. It was filled with his observation and her composure. One evening, as she rose to leave, she paused at the door. "Good night, Your Grace." "Good night, Duchess," he replied, his voice a dry rasp. She closed the door, and he was left with the unsettling realization that for the first time in a very long time, he was curious about what the next day would bring. To properly organize the estate papers, Rebecca required access to the Duke's private study, a room that had been kept locked since the onset of his serious decline. Mr. Finch, the solicitor, granted her the key with a lecture on the sensitivity of the documents within. The room was the heart of the house's inertia, thick with the scent of stale pipe tobacco and sealed air. It was here, in a drawer of the great mahogany desk, beneath a stack of tenant agreements, that she found them. The physician's notes. The folder was thin, the handwriting a sloping, arrogant scrawl. She sat in the Duke's leather chair and began to read. The diagnosis was maddeningly vague. "A wasting sickness," one entry read. "A profound melancholy affecting the vital humors," stated another. Dr. Alcroft seemed more interested in poetic descriptions of the Duke's pallor than in any substantive pathology. There were no fevers recorded, no specific organ failure noted. It was the prescribed treatment that made the hairs on her arms stand up. A daily tonic, to be administered each morning. The ingredients were listed. She read them once, then twice, her blood turning to ice. Most were innocuous: gentian for appetite, a tincture of iron for the blood. But the third ingredient was Convallaria majalis, lily of the valley. Her mind flashed back to Master Hemlock's workshop, his stern voice lecturing her on the poisons that masquerade as cures. "Foxglove and lily of the valley, Rebecca," he had warned, "are the gardeners of the heart. They can make it beat stronger, or they can bid it to be still. The line between the dose and the poison is a spider's thread." The plant contained cardiac glycosides. In minute, precise doses, it could treat a weak heart. But administered daily, in a slightly too large dose, the effects would be cumulative and devastating. It would not appear as a sudden poison, but as a slow, inexorable decline. Fatigue, nausea, confusion, a faltering pulse, a creeping weakness that mimicked the symptoms of a terminal wasting disease. It was a perfect, untraceable murder weapon. She found the tonic bottle on his bedside table that afternoon, a dark green glass vial with a handwritten label. It was nearly full. The slow poison was still being administered. A terrible question bloomed in her mind. Was he doing this to himself? A slow, deliberate suicide? Or was someone doing it to him? His words in the chapel echoed in her memory. "This is not what it seems." He had been trying to warn her. That night, she could not sleep. She went to the library, seeking the comfort of its silent, orderly shelves. She found him there, sitting in a wingback chair by the fire, a book lying unread in his lap. He looked exhausted, a ghost haunting his own home. This was the crisis. She could remain silent, let events run their course, and be a wealthy widow. Or she could step into the heart of the secret. She walked toward the fire, holding her own leather-bound notebook. "Your Grace," she began, her voice quiet but firm in the vast room. "We need to talk about your medicine." His pale gray eyes snapped open, and for the first time, she saw not weary intelligence, but a flicker of raw, unguarded alarm. The wall of indifference between them had just been breached. The library was silent save for the crackle of the fire. Alistair stared at her, his expression a mask of disbelief and suspicion. "My medicine is a matter for my physician," he said, his voice low and dismissive. Rebecca did not flinch. She opened her notebook to a page of detailed drawings of the lily-of-the-valley plant. "Dr. Alcroft prescribes a daily tonic containing Convallaria majalis," she stated, her tone as clinical as if she were consulting with Master Hemlock. "In small doses, it is a cardiac stimulant. In the dose he has prescribed, administered over months, it is a cumulative poison that mimics a wasting sickness." She met his gaze directly. "It is killing you slowly." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with years of his isolation and her newfound, terrifying knowledge. He did not deny it. He simply watched her, his sharp eyes searching her face for a hint of guile, of the ambition he expected from everyone. "Why?" he finally rasped. "Why tell me this? You have only to wait." It was the core of the matter. Her silence was her inheritance. "Because it is a lie," she answered simply. "And I have had enough of lies." She took a step closer. "I will not be a party to a murder, whether it is your own choice or another's." Starting the next morning, she took control. She dismissed the nurse who administered the tonic, claiming she would see to the Duke's care personally. She poured the contents of the green vial into the fire, watching the poison hiss and evaporate. In its place, she began preparing her own infusions, brewed in the kitchens from the herbs she was cultivating in the physicsy garden, a tea of willow bark for his aches, a tincture of hawthorn berry to gently support his heart, a broth fortified with nettle and dandelion root to cleanse his blood and restore his strength. It was a slow, arduous process. For days he seemed to worsen as his body recoiled from the withdrawal of the drug. He was weak, feverish, and plagued by nightmares. Rebecca sat by his bedside, bathing his forehead with cool cloths, forcing nourishing soups past his lips. Mrs. Gable and Elspeth watched, their faces etched with concern, but they did not interfere. They saw the care in her hands, the fierce determination in her eyes. And then one morning, the fever broke. He woke, his eyes clear for the first time in months. The color was beginning to return to his face. It was on that day, a week into his recovery, that the threat arrived. A carriage crunched up the gravel drive, bearing the Harlan crest. Her father and stepmother come to check on the progress of their investment. They swept into the morning room, their faces masks of feigned concern. "Rebecca, my dear child," her father boomed. "We were so worried. We came to see how you were bearing up under the strain." Her stepmother's eyes darted around the room, assessing the furniture, before landing on Rebecca. "You look well. Surprisingly so. And the Duke, is he comfortable?" They smelled of greed and impatience. Before Rebecca could answer, a voice came from the doorway, weak but steady. "I am quite comfortable, thank you. Alistair stood there, leaning on a cane, but standing on his own. He was dressed not in a sick robe, but in a proper coat and trousers. The shock on the Harlans' faces was profound. They looked from the Duke's upright form to Rebecca, and a dark, ugly suspicion dawned in their eyes. Alistair walked slowly into the room and came to stand beside Rebecca's chair. He did not touch her, but his presence was a shield. "Your concern is noted," he said, his voice laced with iron. "And unnecessary. My wife is taking excellent care of me." After her family departed, leaving a wake of stunned silence and thwarted ambition, a new kind of quiet settled over Stanhope Hall. It was not the oppressive stillness of before, but a space of contemplation. The unspoken had been brought into the light, and their alliance, born of a grim transaction, was now forged in a shared secret and a common enemy. That evening, Alistair found her in the physic garden. The setting sun cast long shadows across the neatened rows of herbs, and the air was fragrant with mint and thyme. She was kneeling, her hands in the earth, firming the soil around a newly planted lavender bush. He stood watching her for a long moment, the way he had from his window, but this time it was different. He was not observing a stranger. He was trying to understand the woman who had saved his life. "They will be back," he said, his voice startling her. She looked up, her face smudged with dirt. "I know. They will not be pleased that their investment is appreciating in value." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first she had ever seen. He walked closer, using his cane for support, and gestured to a stone bench. "May I?" She nodded, rising and wiping her hands on her apron. They sat together, the space between them no longer a chasm of formality. "You never answered my question," he said, looking out over the garden she was bringing back to life. "In the library? I asked you why you helped me." "I told you," she replied. "I would not be party to a lie." "There are easier ways to live," he countered. "Most of the world is built on convenient lies." He turned to look at her, his pale gray eyes searching her face. "I have spent the last 5 years trusting no one. My cousin, Lord Ashworth, the man who stood to inherit, tried to have me declared incompetent. He conspired with the woman I was to marry. She told me she loved me while her lawyers were drafting papers to have me committed to an asylum. Since then, this house has been my fortress. I built the walls so high I could not see over them." His confession was delivered in a low, factual tone, but it laid his history bare. He was not just ill. He was wounded, betrayed by the very people who should have stood by him. "Dr. Alcroft was my father's physician," he continued. "I trusted him. It seems Ashworth's purse was more persuasive than my loyalty." He looked at her hands, still dusted with soil. "And then you arrived. I expected a vulture in a wedding dress. Instead, you tended my garden." The simplicity of the observation struck her more than any grand declaration of gratitude could have. He saw her. He saw the work. He understood its meaning. "You do not mend things for reward," he said, his voice softening. "You mend them because they are broken." He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the bench. His touch was warm, firm, the skin of his palm calloused from gripping his cane. It was not the touch of a dying man. It was the touch of an ally, a partner. In the fading light of the garden, surrounded by the healing herbs, the wall he had built around himself finally began to crumble. Weeks turned into a month, and with each passing day, Alistair grew stronger. The gaunt hollows in his face filled out, the stoop in his shoulders lessened, and the iron resolve that had been hidden beneath layers of illness returned to his eyes. He walked the halls of his home without a cane, his step firm and sure. He and Rebecca spent their evenings in the library, not in silence, but in conversation. He spoke of his plans for the estate, crop rotations, tenant farm improvements, and he listened, truly listened, as she detailed her own ideas for the household, for a small cottage hospital in the village, for the expansion of the physic garden. They were building something together, a future that neither had thought possible. To mark his return to health and to society, Alistair decided to host a dinner, inviting the most prominent families of the county. On the guest list were his solicitor, Mr. Finch, the local magistrate, and, to their profound surprise, Rebecca's father and stepmother. A special handwritten note also summoned Dr. Alcroft. The Harlans arrived in a flurry of expensive silks and false smiles, their eyes widening at the sight of the Duke. He was not merely surviving, he was thriving. He stood at the head of the grand staircase to greet his guests, looking every inch the powerful nobleman he was. At his side stood Rebecca. She was not in one of her plain, serviceable dresses. Alistair had commissioned a gown for her from London, a creation of deep midnight blue silk that shimmered in the candlelight and turned her quiet composure into regal grace. A simple string of Stanhope pearls rested against her throat. When her father saw her, his jaw tightened. This was not the pliable, disposable daughter he had sold. This was the Duchess of Stanhope, and she was magnificent. At dinner, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Dr. Alcroft sweated under the Duke's polite but pointed questions about modern medicine. The Harlans picked at their food, their unease palpable. After the main course of roast duck and spiced potatoes was cleared, Alistair rose, a wine glass in his hand. "I would like to propose a toast," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the dining hall, to honesty, and to its opposite. He let the words hang in the air. He then calmly recounted the story of his mysterious illness, the vague diagnosis, the steady decline. He produced the physician's folder of notes. "Dr. Alcroft diagnosed a wasting sickness," he said, his eyes locking with the terrified doctor's. "However, my wife, whose knowledge of simples and compounds is formidable, discovered a discrepancy." He held up a small green vial. "She found that my daily tonic was, in fact, a carefully calibrated poison, administered by a physician in the pay of my cousin, Lord Ashworth, who was impatient for his inheritance." A collective gasp went through the room. "The Harlans," Alistair continued, his gaze shifting to them, cold as a winter frost, "saw an opportunity not for a son-in-law, but for a corpse. They drew up a contract to seize this estate through their daughter the moment I died." He placed a hand on Rebecca's shoulder. "They and my cousin underestimated the Duchess. She is not a key to be turned in a lock. She is the mistress of this house, and she saved my life." The magistrate was already on his feet. The Harlans sat frozen, their faces ashen. Dr. Alcroft had collapsed in his chair. In that moment, before the entire county, Alistair had not rescued Rebecca. He had validated her, naming her competence, her intelligence, her worth aloud for all to see. The plot was exposed, the villains ruined. Together, they had faced the threat and won. The aftermath of the dinner was swift and decisive. The magistrate took Dr. Alcroft into custody, his confession implicating Lord Ashworth, who was arrested in London the following day. The Harlans fled back to their home in disgrace, their social standing shattered, their names a byword for avarice and ghoulish scheming. A profound quiet, one of peace rather than neglect, descended upon Stanhope Hall. The machinery of the house, under Rebecca's steady hand, now ran smoothly, efficiently, and with a newfound sense of purpose. The staff worked with a quiet pride, their loyalty to their new Duchess absolute. A few nights later, Alistair found Rebecca in the library, the fire casting a warm, golden glow on the spines of the books she had saved. She was not reading, but simply looking into the flames, her hands resting in her lap. He came and stood behind her chair, his presence comfortable, familiar. "The solicitor came today," he said softly. "He tells me the marriage contract, predicated as it was on a criminal conspiracy by your father, is null. It can be dissolved without scandal or difficulty." He paused, and the entire future seemed to hang in the space of that silence. "If that is what you wish." Rebecca did not turn. She thought of the life she had been sent from, the coldness of her father, the bitterness of her stepmother. Then she thought of this house, of the scent of beeswax and old paper, of the satisfaction of a balanced ledger, of the feel of rich soil under her fingernails. She had not been given a home, but she had made one. "And where would I go?" she asked, her voice even. "You are the Duchess of Stanhope. You would be provided for, of course. A house, an income." His voice trailed off, the words sounding hollow and inadequate even to him. She finally turned in her chair to look up at him. "I am not asking about a provision, Alistair. I am asking where my home would be." She saw the answer in his eyes before he spoke. He reached down, taking her hand and drawing her to her feet. "Your home is here," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to conceal. "If you will have it. If you will have me." "The contract is void," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact that needed to be acknowledged. "Yes," he agreed, "and I find I no longer have any interest in its terms. I am interested only in the woman who saw the truth in a bottle of poison, the woman who rebuilt my garden and my life." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. "The woman I love." He said it plainly, in the same register he used for facts of which he was certain. It was not a plea, but a statement of truth. "Rebecca," he said, his gaze holding hers, "you are the Duchess of Stanhope. But more than that, I would be honored if you would consent to be my wife. In truth, this time." She did not need a contract or a title. She needed this. This man, this home. "Yes," she whispered. "I will." The following spring, the Physic Garden was a tapestry of life. Rows of chamomile bowed their white and gold heads in the gentle breeze, and the air was thick with the clean scents of rosemary and lemon balm. The rose bushes, once skeletal and choked, were now heavy with deep crimson blossoms. The restoration was complete. Rebecca stood on the path, a basket of harvested mint in her hand, the sun warm on her face. A pair of hands settled on her shoulders, strong and familiar. Alistair came to stand beside her, his arm sliding around her waist as he looked out over the thriving plot. "Master Hemlock would be impressed," he said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. "He would say I had a talented apprentice," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. Their life had settled into a rhythm of shared purpose and deep, unspoken understanding. The grand rooms of Stanhope Hall were no longer silent and empty. They were filled with the murmur of a busy household, with plans for the estate, with the low cadence of their conversations late into the night. What had begun as the coldest of transactions had, through honesty and competence, become real. The brittle contract had been replaced by a living partnership, a bond stronger than any legal document. Alistair had found a partner whose clarity had saved him from more than just poison. It had saved him from the prison of his own bitterness. Rebecca had found a home not through inheritance or obligation, but through her own capable hands and the steady gaze of a man who saw her for exactly who she was. He turned her to face him, his gray eyes warm in the sunlight. He brushed a stray piece of mint from her hair, his touch gentle. The gold band on her finger, once a symbol of her sale, was now a simple, solid reminder of a promise freely made and freely kept. He did not need to speak. His love was in the way he looked at her, in the quiet strength of his hand linked with hers, in the shared peace of this garden they had brought back to life together. They stood for a long moment, two people who had been discarded by the world, now essential to each other, the heart of a home that was finally, truly awake. Thank you for staying with us through this story of healing and quiet love. Would you have been brave enough to trust the Duke after discovering the secret of his medicine? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where in the world you are watching from. The best alliances, after all, are often the ones no one else can see.